The circle of life. One of mankind's most important lessons. A never-ending cycle that will continue until the end of time. And what better way to present its meaning, other than the musical number, to the opening of one of Disney's most beloved entries, The Lion King. If you haven't seen any indication on my channel, I have a huge admiration for this movie and the franchise. I'm such a dork that I had a DVD collection of these in high school, and I still own the original VHS tape, even though I no longer own a VCR. But from the brief mentions of the title in my reviews and the obvious references I have carried, it shouldn't be surprising at all. This movie was a huge role in my childhood, and to an extent a film that spoke to me at an older age. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but this movie in particular has a special place in my heart. Celebrating the 25th anniversary, I'm going to be reviewing this movie and its later installments throughout the rest of this year. Yes, that also includes The Lion Guard, but only the pilot and not the series. I also won't be covering anything else, not the Timon and Pumbaa series, not the video game releases, just the movies. So with that being said, we're going back to where my 6-year-old imagination started, the open Serengeti in the heart of Africa. Welcome to Returning to Pride Rock. So what is there that hasn't been said already? The Lion King has been a beloved film for years and has been given its praises by critics. There's raw emotional weight, it contains some heavy scenes and some uplifting scenes that complement each other, and some of the most iconic moments are still lived up to date. The opening sequence, the connection between Mufasa and Simba, the wildebeest stampede, the spiritual conversation with Mufasa, just to name a few. But what is it that makes me appreciate this movie compared to the masses? Let me first answer with the fact that it's not the greatest movie ever made. Yes, I believe it's a great movie, and I did claim it's one of Disney's best, but there are still technically better movies, and especially outside of the Disney canon and its brand. Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, The Secret of NIMH, Ghost in the Shell, The Iron Giant, the list goes on. But does that mean that this movie should be turned away? Absolutely not. But as I review this, I do have to take off the rose-tinted glasses and give some needed criticisms. Starting off with is The Circle of Life. You couldn't find anything more perfect of the start of a movie. Its gorgeous visuals of the shot of the rising sun, the wide scope of the Pride Rock, all of which is presented masterfully with no dialogue or opening credits, thus preparing you on something big at what the story unfolds after the scene closes to the movie's title with a thunderous boom. It embraces showing without telling. Many other Disney movies have always started with a narration of some kind, or dialogue of exposition that sets up the world we're set in. The composition also works especially well in favor of this opening sequence, and the only purpose for the song's existence. Lebo M and the leading vocalist, Carmen Twiley, do an excellent job providing such atmosphere of feeling like you're in the savannah, thanks to its African choir. Additionally, this works well with Hans Zimmer's orchestral work, with such tracks like To Die For and This Land. Parts of the musicals carry Lebo M's choir, but unfortunately I'll be saving that for later in this review as it is a drawback. Aside from the coming-of-age formula that we are familiar with, this movie is about guilt, responsibility, the importance of leadership, and the surprises you find in life, and much more upon speculation. This is one of the many reasons why I adore this movie. It carries such topics that even in the eyes of an adult they can take from. The plot, while taking a bit to get to, is about Simba's inner confrontation on guilt. Before the actual plot kicks in, however, we're given a day's worth of feeling settled within the Pride Lands of knowing our main protagonist and its idol. The moments that are carried within both Simba and Mufasa provide a strong emotional connection. The character Mufasa is a well-rounded, very respectable character that I feel very comfortable being with. He's the kind of character you'd want to look up to and easily have him put on a pedestal. He only has a small amount of screen time in the movie, but his impression is already integral to the plot of the film. This is also in part to his deep and wonderful voice provided by James Earl Jones. He would later reprise his role in the remake, which, while I'm not looking forward to, I do have to give credit where credit is due. Mufasa is a character that no one else can top other than James himself. Simba, while arrogant and egotistic, is very energetic and curious to anything he'll try to challenge his ego for. But as very flawed, he has much to learn, and while he does have his rash behavior, he wants to impress his father deep down. So while the father and son duo have been a known cliche, this works phenomenally well. The teacher and the apprentice who faces trial and error via emotions and parenthood. In addition, by Simba's defiance to explore outer territories, there's more of the environment to know about. In particular, the elephant graveyard is we're introduced to three hyenas, Shenzi, Bunzai, and Ed. That's the only time their names are mentioned, by the way. It's later on that we learn they're henchmen of Scar, whose jealousy and envious phase starts the plot. Scar is one of those villains who has been skeptically praised, but his approach is an impressive breath of fresh air to other Disney villains. As most aim for control and tyranny, Scar gets it early on and is faced with the aftermath. Jeremy Irons pulls off a very raspy and cynical attitude to his tone. He's manipulative, he's snarky, deadpan, and it's glorious. His character, especially in the second half, illustrates the outcomes of a power-hungry dictator after he gets what he wants compared to the very cliché villain who's always wanting power. He acts childishly in the second half in contrast to other villains, which to others is taken as an issue. But this complements the view Simba has had in his childhood by the given knowledge of leadership.
But I thought a king can do whatever he wants.
Oh, there's more to being king than getting your way all the time.
There's more?
Simba.
It goes without saying, great power comes great responsibility. When Scar takes over, he doesn't learn that. He was never taught that. Instead, he becomes abusive and irresponsible to the point where the Pride Lands are driven to starvation. But despite how miserable he is, he remains stubborn by his own desire of running the kingdom he wanted his whole life. His own pride and desires blinds him.
And so be it.
You can't do that.
I am the king. I can do whatever I want.
Near the end of the movie, when he confronts Scar, he shifts the blame to the hyenas, which shows how unwilling he is to take responsibility by his own paws by not facing his mistakes. This is something for Simba to take part in the right direction. The contrast to these two characters really show. Now granted, this has been mentioned before, and it's part of why some people don't like Scar. Some people just love the good old-fashioned, simple, dastardly villains. But the way I see it, Scar is a villain who's written tragically, a usurper who only relies on his own desires over needs to the point of horrendous commitments, murdering his own brother to take his own place, guilt-tripping his spouse over the scenario, just to only get what he wants. It's depressing, but it's a role model of what happens when you're only desperate on what you want and only what you want. This isn't for everyone, but I love this archetype. Getting back to Simba, Jonathan Taylor Thomas and Matthew Broderick do a solid job voicing the roles. They provide such emotions needed for Simba's inner conflict. From the beginning of his life, he's excited to take control of a kingdom, but out of his own arrogance, he's tricked into thinking his actions are the cause of his father's death. It's a guilt over his shoulders that haunts him through his adulthood. While he does sit around thirds of the plot, though, there's a sense of guilt that he tries hiding or steering away from when trying to live a different and carefree life. It gets more frustrating for him, it gets more difficult for him, and it's pretty intense, especially in a film that a younger audience can watch. He goes through his life in one of the most unfortunate circumstances, which is admittedly extreme, but gets its point across as a lesson everyone should know as addressed by Rafiki.
Oh yes, the past can hurt. But the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it.
Beautiful. As much as the past can hurt, learn from them. That's the basic moral told on a large scale. No further than that. Sometimes morals are told early on instead of being told at the end, and in this case it was necessary to do so that the message can drive Simba to commit his return. And confronting his inner demons as well as Scar near the end of the movie is why Simba is still one of my favorite protagonists to this day. There's main protagonists who are often curious for a sense of adventure, which are known as the hero's journey, but the ones I often like are self-confrontation. It addresses to the viewer that in times in your life, you can be your own worst enemy by your own fears and insecurities. And even when seeking or being given help from others, it's a conflict that you have to face on your own. Simba deals with these traits, and it's very applicable to taking place as ruler since every decision of authority is very delicate. So, with all these gushing details out of the way, and I'm sure some of you probably rolled your eyes over it, it's time I face the actual problems the movie does have. The first of which are the rest of the characters. Let me point out that I don't hate any of them, I find them all very enjoyable in their own right, but in hindsight I do feel they could have been written better. Starting off with is Timon and Pumbaa, a duo that consists of a snarky loudmouth and a warm-hearted dummy. The way they bounce off each other is admittedly hilarious by their exchange in dialogue. Both Nathan Lane and Ernie Sabella were perfect for these roles. However, this kind of duo is a preferred taste compared to the likes of other comic relief characters, being zany and energetic, like Sebastian from The Little Mermaid, or the genie from Aladdin. It also doesn't help that there's the unfortunate addition of toilet and burp jokes to where Timon censored the term to Pumbaa for some reason.
Every time that Hey, Pumbaa! Not in front of the kids.
Oh, sorry.
Comparatively, I find myself enjoying the hyenas more, not just because of their energy and zaniness, but by their sarcastic and ironic dialogue shared thanks to Whoopi Goldberg and Cheech Marin.
Man, I hate lions. So pushy and hairy
And stinky.
and man, are they
Ugly.
Yeah, it's funny because that's what they are. But in all seriousness, what adds more irony later in the movie is that these three dumbasses even know about Scar's poor leadership when he takes the throne. You know it's a sad day when morons can piece together what you're doing wrong. But given their circumstances, they're too weak to speak up and call out on his bullshit.
I thought things were bad under Mufasa.
What did you say?
I said I said, ¿Qué pasa?
Obviously, the third and final hyena that I have to mention is Ed. He easily steals the show. There's no lines, no dialogue, or even a word. All he has to do is laugh like a moron. And Jim Cummings does this phenomenally. Not to mention his laugh can turn psychopathically with little effort. And on that topic, I find the end of the hyenas delivered on a high note as they end their starvation by devouring Scar. Sweet, sweet revenge, but served hot this time. Beautiful. But with that said, does that devalue Timon and Pumbaa? Absolutely not. Timon definitely delivers hysterical reactions over what he is told or what he is doing in such a hyperbolic manner that can relate to the audience. Pumbaa, while being a dummy, is such a blissful and innocent warthog that I can't help but appreciate him. The only gripe I really have with these two is their potty humor, as I mentioned before, but that's only small potatoes, especially compared to a later entry that I will have to address. Diving into Nala, she's an okay character. There are times when she could have been written better, such as when an adult there was a moment where she briefly stated that she left to find help. This immediately breaks the rule of show don't tell. Having scenes where she was leaving or escaping the Pride Lands would have been a better choice to include, as it would have added more weight to her character, being the witness of Scar's abuse of power and having the fortunate result of running into Simba. But that isn't the case. On the contrary, I do appreciate that she has fond memories of Simba on top of feeling awestruck at his presence after thinking he was dead. I can definitely see that kind of reaction in her, struggling to process what she just discovered.
It's like you're back from the dead. You don't know how much this will mean to everyone. What it means to me.
The biggest gripe I do have at most is how her relationship started with Simba. It was unnaturally paced as it was thrown at the last minute. Most Disney romance duets are often iconic and appreciated at their own pace, but here it was clunky at best, and that's a shame because their song was wonderful to listen to, but afterwards it's just pushed to the sidelines. To its credit, it does lead to a personal discussion Nala tries to give to Simba afterwards, informing him that there's hope for the Pride Lands but struggling to be the voice of reason when telling him to go back. Part of what made her character more enjoyable mostly reflects from her childhood. She was a lot more fun to have being with Simba as she was good at pinning him. This can only be taken with a pinch of salt, but it's a good lead up to her adulthood. There really isn't much else to say other than she did her part, and both Moira Kelly and Nikita Kalam-Harris did their jobs on these roles respectfully. As far as the rest of the characters go, they certainly do their part. I don't have much to say about them, so I'll just breeze through them one at a time. Starting with Zazu, he's pretty much written as a punching bag, especially during I Just Can't Wait to Be King. I find it odd that he's voiced by Rowan Atkinson, because he's known for Mr. Bean and other comedic roles, and yet Zazu is just a stuck-up. It's quite a dramatic difference. Aside from that, Zazu was just okay and served its purpose of being a bump monkey. I especially loved it when he was target practice when Mufasa taught Simba to pounce.
Try not to make a sound.
What are you telling him, Mufasa? Mufasa? Simba?
As for Surabhi, Simba's mother, the most impressive moment that I do get from her was when she tried reasoning with Scar with a brave face, only to be knocked down because of his terrible leadership being called out on. She was voiced by Madge Sinclair, who, funny enough, played in another movie with James Earl Jones, Coming to America, and both of them were parental figures. Sadly though, Surabhi was the last role she had before she passed away in December of 1995 of leukemia. Next is Serafina, who has a small role as Nala's mother. Her name was never mentioned, but she did have one line in both this and the sequel. She was voiced by Zoe Leader, who sadly passed away in 2015 of cancer. And last but not least, there's Robert Guillaume as Rafiki, who was the latest to pass in 2017. This mystical shaman has very minimal screen time, but like Mufasa, his role was such an impact on the movie. Obviously raising Simba over the rock, but also the way he's animated, the way he expresses any situation, and his wisecracking lines that bring forth wisdom to Simba, along with legit phrases that also bring forth wisdom. As you guessed it, Rafiki is one of my favorite characters next to Simba and Mufasa. He's so full of life, and I just want to have a banana with this baboon. It's traits like these that make me appreciate small roles who deliver so much. So getting into the musicals, the soundtrack is fun to listen to, but only to a certain degree. This is where I have to address the drawback. While The Circle of Life works beautifully with the presentation of the opening, the song in and of itself I've had issues listening to on its own by its overlong notes. Lyrics like life, all, hope, and love are all tail ends of each line that overstay their welcome. This could just be an issue with me personally, but it always feels awkward listening to it, especially fearing somebody would call out on it. I don't mean to harp on this song, but I always preferred hearing it in the movie instead of just the soundtrack itself. But of course we come to Hakuna Matata. As a kid, it was fun listening to this non-stop. I love the way the characters danced and swung around, especially after the stampede scene. It does its job at cheering the audience up. However, as an adult, I do appreciate its uplifting nature, but what could have been done better is if the song was more solid. Most of what is presented here is very dialogue-driven, and the chorus is sung over and over and over again. Some in melodically different variations, but there's one verse that centers on Pumbaa's backstory, and not so much for Timon for some reason. This to me feels very lackluster, and it just seemed like an afterthought. Listening to it on the soundtrack is especially awkward, as most of which is instrumental sections, which is meant to be a musical. Don't get me wrong, it's a very iconic and catchy song that is well recognized in the film, but from where it stands, Hakuna Matata holds as my least favorite musical. Thankfully, there was a cover of this song done by Lebo M with the inclusion of Jimmy Cliff as the leading vocals. It wasn't in the main soundtrack for some reason, but I did find the song in one of the extra features in the 2003 Special Edition DVD. By comparison, it's a lot more solid with a wonderful reggae beat. I highly recommend checking it out. So next is I Just Can't Wait to Be King. Yeah, I know, that's a really long title. But by comparison, it's a much more fun song to listen to, and it carries a lot more lyrics and more variation than a repeated chorus. Not to mention, the opening melody is so catchy, letting you know what you're in for, and the way the song ends brings more life, energy, and excitement by the choir. Even to this day, I still get chills down my back. But while having that said upbeat, catchy tune with psychedelic colors, it suffers from beating the excitement of Simba's future of ruling the kingdom overboard. Before the song begins, a majority of Simba's screen time revolves around him telling everyone he's going to be king one day.
One day, Simba, the sun will set on my time here, and will rise with you as the new king.
And this'll all be mine?
Everything.
I'm gonna be king of Pride Rock. But when I'm king, that'll be the first thing to go.
Granted, I don't take issue with it personally because he's just a kid who's excited so much that he'll say it non-stop. And to its credit, the song explains why he's so excited, as well as claiming he'll be the best king he can be, what he plans to do, and how luxurious it feels being at the top of the throne. But for the most part, it takes up too much time beforehand, which can throw some people off. This alone knocks the song down a peg, but it still holds up as one of the better musical numbers. Coming into Scar's song, Be Prepared is easily my favorite musical, as well as one of my favorite villain songs, period. It helps us learn what he plans to do, what his motives are after learning about his dethroned position, and how the dialogue and the lyrics mesh together very naturally. Also, there's no escaping the Nazi imagery midway in the song. After the volcanic floor quakes and Scar is being risen up, unsettling chills flowed through my back like a waterfall. Truth be told, Jeremy Irons had trouble with his voice, so Jim Cummings had to take over. Until someone mentions it, I never noticed the differences in the segment. He did that good of a job as a temporary placement. Needless to say, this song is borderline awesome. As for Can You Feel the Love Tonight, I'm definitely on the fence with this one. On the one hand, I love the melody. Yeah, it's cheesy and cliche, but it works. But then there's the verse lyrics, which are too narrative driven. While musicals have lyrics that are meant to be integral to the story, they also have to be able to stand on their own. Take instance Kiss the Girl from The Little Mermaid, where it establishes Ariel's close chances with Eric to gain the needed kiss, but it is recognizable on its own merits. A Whole New World is another one, establishing the connection between Aladdin and Jasmine and experiencing pure escapism, but also having it recognizable on its own. Can You Feel the Love Tonight, however, does not do that. Instead, the verse lyrics talk about the turmoil Simba is having, which isn't relevant to the moment between Simba and Nala. If there were any lyrics I did love, it was the chorus itself. Words like "the peace the evening brings" or "a world for once in perfect harmony" were wonderful to hear. And I loved the changing key at the end from F to G major. It's frustrating to say the least, but it's a song like The Circle of Life where I'm only able to enjoy it by watching it in the movie and not on its own. And despite the lyrical issues, the moments with Simba and Nala were fun to watch as they get in such mischief. There is the Elton John ballad where the lyrics were much more solidified and capable of standing on its own. But the lyrics were also changed. Terms like kings and vagabonds doesn't click or make sense to me. Why couldn't they just keep the peace the evening brings? For that matter, what was wrong with disregarding the key change like the musical version did? Other end credit ballad songs in other Disney movies have done this. I'm nitpicking at this point. I love the song, don't get me wrong, but the lyrics had a lot of room for improvement. As you guessed it, I find the musicals and the many side characters in this movie to be a huge hit and miss. And it's tough for me to process that because I grew up recognizing these characters. I grew up recognizing these songs. They're still fun to watch and they're still fun to listen to, but as I grow up, it's important to acknowledge and realize that they aren't always the best. There are other Disney movies that pull this off better. Truth be told, both this and Pocahontas were in production at the same time, and Disney expected the latter half to be the big one. But lo and behold, it was the complete opposite. It became one of the highest grossing movies of 1994 and has been crowned as one of the highest grossing movies, period. I used to put this movie on a pedestal in my early 20s, but I grew to realize that it shouldn't be idolized over anything else. No movie ever should. And that's okay. There is no greatest movie ever. It's one thing to love something regardless of its flaws, but it's another to lock yourself up in an echo chamber, neglecting objective merits of something you love. So, putting all the technicals aside, it still begs the question, what is it that makes me appreciate this movie, even at an adult age? Why is it still my favorite Disney movie, even with all its flaws that were pointed out? Why does it level up with other movies that I thoroughly love and adore? Is it because of the fond memories? Is it because of the bright colors of the movie's atmosphere? Kind of, yes. But it was an experience like no other. The beautiful, speechless opening, the heavy subject matters that were provided even to kids, and even a different crew compared to the previously mentioned titles. Instead of Alan Menken for musicals, it was Tim Rice. Instead of Ron Clements and John Musker as directors, it was directed by two different directors who would later take on Stuart Little in The Forbidden Kingdom. It took a risk by doing something different, and while it was a trial and error, it still managed to leave such an impression I have never expected. It brought such memories that I'll never forget. Reenacting the scenes from the movie during recess, roughhousing his lines with my brother at home as if we were Simba or Scar, or listening to the soundtrack by Hans Zimmer with Lebo M and Elton John. I mean, fuck, dude! Elton John was one of my favorite musicians growing up. The One, Benny and the Jets, Candle in the Wind, and my personal favorites, Your Song and Tiny Dancer. So that immediately put something personal in my impression. I was 6 years old when the movie was out, and the impression that it has left me was huge. Unfortunately, it would be left behind for years to come. But then, in my teen years, I came back to it again at a time when I was forcefully looking down on movies that were geared towards a younger audience. I always felt insecure in liking kids' movies, as the standards in junior high and high school were unpleasant. But when I popped in that VHS copy again, those memories flooded back in my eyes. I was 15 years old at the time, and it felt like this was a missing part of my life that I was turning away from the whole time. Realizing how long it has been, I almost wanted to break down crying, missing those times so bad when life was simple. And the fact that I can never revisit those times ever again, it was very hard to process. It would later bring me back to watching this movie more often after I got home from school as a piece of escapism, and forgetting all the troubled times I've had. It was awkward to say the least, but what I was experiencing that time was nostalgia. It's often perceived as a shallow reason nowadays because it's an answer to one's personal connection with their childhood whenever it's something that they liked, whether it was playing with their toy lightsaber on a playground or catching a baseball with their dad in a front yard. But what brought me back to this movie again as an adult is that I appreciated the many topics that it provided me: grievances, confronting your guilt, and taking responsibility and leadership. The movie did it in such a way that it fascinated me. Granted, other movies did it better, but it was ambitious to me to see it tackled on to where I was willing to come back to watching it once more. That's part of why I had this movie be carried with me over the years. No other Disney movie has done that. And I'm not saying other Disney films have done it less. This movie just happens to speak to me as it reminded me of that said experience. I know that others have had this impact with many other mentioned titles, and I give them full respect for it. I don't have the best answers, but that's the closest I can give. When it comes to talking about what my favorite movies are or what my favorite is of anything, I don't look for what is borderline perfect. I look for what is the most satisfying, most entertaining, and what I can get the most out of. The Lion King did just that. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be flawless. Technically, no movie ever does. It only needs to entertain and bring forth something that the viewer can get an impact of. To this day, The Lion King is and will always be one of my favorite movies of all time, no matter what. Thank you, Disney. Thank you. This is only the beginning, as it would gain a sequel, a prequel, and a TV pilot. But for now, this is where I end the first chapter of Returning to Pride Rock. Until next time, this is GoldenFox, and take care.